In this tutorial, we will cover chapter 4.2 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More precisely, we will show how to create endpoint that allows us to download an Excel file. So inside this endpoint, we will actually create an Excel file and allow user to download it. In order for this to work, we have to manually add these two dependencies to a POM XML file. Once we do that, we will have access to Java classes that allows us to generate an Excel file. We will create a single controller, and in that controller we will have two endpoints. This endpoint will simply contain a hyperlink to the other endpoint, which actually downloads the Excel file. When the application will be done, this will look like this. We can then enter the URL of the first endpoint in order to show this download link, but when we actually click on the link, the other endpoint will be called, the one that actually creates an Excel file and downloads it. And the downloaded Excel file would look like this. It will have just a single row with a single cell saying hello world. So let's see how we can create an endpoint that creates and returns an Excel file. So this is our first endpoint that only contains a link to the second endpoint, and this second endpoint will be the one that is actually generating an Excel file and allowing us to download it. So in order to create an Excel file, we start with this line. Then inside the Excel file, next we need to create at least one sheet, which is done by using these lines, and we are also defining the width of the columns in that sheet so that our text would completely fit within it. Then, in order to create a row in a sheet, we simply call this line, and in order to insert a cell, populate a cell within the sheet, we can call these two lines, which create a cell and then defines the content of that cell. And then we can use this code to return the Excel file that was generated with previous lines. So we are basically returning a workbook object which was created at the beginning of the endpoint, and which was then modified with this additional line. So here we are adding a sheet to the workbook, and then here we are adding row to the sheet, and then we are adding cell to the row. And at the end we are then returning this workbook with a sheet, row, and a single cell. And as already shown previously, this will create an Excel file that looks like this. And if you take a look at POM XML, there should be these additional dependencies that need to be added manually. Now we will show how to create a little bit more complicated Excel file, the one that has a header. And by header we mean that we will use the first row of the Excel sheet as a header row, and the cells in this row will contain the names of the columns. So we will have two columns, name and age, and in the subsequent rows we will be adding values for these columns for every row. Again, we will have two endpoints, one that just displays a download link and the other endpoint that actually generates and downloads an Excel file. And again, we have to manually add these dependencies to POM.xml file for code to work. So this is our controller. So this is the first endpoint, which only returns a download link. And this download link then calls this second endpoint that generates the Excel file. So just like in the previous example, we start by creating a new workbook, new Excel file. So in that workbook, we create new sheet with this name, and then we specified the width of the cells column in that sheet. And this here, we are creating first row that will be used as a header, which is why in that row we are we will not be adding actual values, but just the names of the row. So in this row we are creating first cell and populate it with value name, and then we are creating a second cell and populate it with the name age. After that, we will create two more rows, but these rows will now contain actual data. So this is the name and age of the person in the first row, and this is the name and age of the person in the second row. Once all this is configured, we can use this code to return and download our workbook that was created here at the beginning of the endpoint. If we now start our application and call this URL, we will access the endpoint that shows us the download link. And once we click on the download link, Excel will be generated and downloaded for us. When we open the Excel file, it would look like this. So the first row is used as a header row and contains the names of the columns, while all the other rows will contain the actual data, names and ages of the persons. As a reminder, for this to work, we needed to manually add these two dependencies to our POM.xml file. This allows all these Java classes to be available for us from our endpoint that generates Excel.